TopMedTalk.
Hello, and welcome to TopMedTalk. I'm Desiree Chappell, your host, and we are covering the COVID-19 from the front lines. I'm in Louisville, Kentucky, but I'm joined by our editor-in-chief in London, in the United Kingdom, Monty Mythen. Hi, Monty.
Hi, Desiree. How are you?
I'm doing okay, faring pretty well here. How are you doing? I know that you've been taking a lot of calls lately.
Yeah, and I was just looking at the phone there because there's a lot happening on the message front in preparation phase. But we are well at home and we are coping well at the moment at University College London hospitals.
Good, fantastic. Well, I'm sure we'll be catching up throughout the coming weeks about what's happening there in the UK. Right now, we have our partner in TopMedTalk, Saul Aronson from Duke University on the line. Hi, Saul. How are you doing?
Hi, Desiree. Hi, Monty.
We just wanted to call and catch up with you and see what was happening at Duke in regards to the COVID crisis.
So I'm certain, like all of us, we're trying to understand and sort through this. North Carolina, Duke, is not as mature in the exposure and consequences as we are seeing on the TV and reading the newspaper, the state of California or the state of New York or New York City or Chicago, but we are very fluid and reacting in a very dynamic way. Last week, we were still doing elective surgery. I think in this country, Tufts and Temple University hospitals, I think, were some of the first to come out and stop doing elective surgery. We, as near as a week or so ago, were still doing what I'll call selective elective surgery, but almost on 12-hour aliquots, our dynamic continues to be updated and changed. And as of now, really through a mandate of the state of North Carolina Medical Society, elective surgery is no longer going to be an acceptable thing to do.
Salt, from our experience in London, we were having a lot of discussions about this today with some senior colleagues. There's absolutely nothing to regret about making that decision as early as possible.
Yeah, it is what it is. Like everyone, it's very difficult to understand what is the right timing of that. We're also sensitive to the fact that there are a lot of people who are dependent on their jobs and the commerce that comes from having a job. And there's also a reality that I think we have to balance in this, just to give both sides of that discussion. The progression of disease doesn't understand the need to stop. And so what is elective in some context still progresses. So when you're talking about vascular disease or cancer, for example, and we were trying to balance that in a responsible way, but that has shifted significantly to, unless it's absolutely necessary, we don't do it.
On that front, we've had some very sobering news in the UK today with some, it would appear, surgical colleagues who are doing elective, we're assuming elective ENT procedures prior to the sort of identification of the symptomatic patient or the tested patient have ended up quite unwell. And it's the realization that, listening to our colleagues in Italy and before that in China, is how many of us are possibly and or probably infected carriers at this stage, but asymptomatic infective carriers. So the more we get a lid, because we're in no way, shape or form protected as infectors or infectees, recipients of the COVID-19 at this stage, it's a very important ramp-up stage to sort of say, just assume everyone's got it, everyone has got it.
Yeah. Right. Sobering, but true and responsible. And so we've evolved here at Duke to that practice, if you will. I would report, and I'd be curious to see how you in Louisville or London are managing to this reality as well. There's just simply a shortage of patient protective equipment. So we're coming up with algorithms and scenario planning where by the few masks and or other protective equipment we have will be distributed. Of course, we're having to hide it behind desks so people don't and all that kind of silliness. But that's a reality that we're confronting here at Duke, and I'm sure others are experiencing that in their environments as well. But it all is on the backdrop of we simply don't have enough of that equipment. And so we're trying to come up with scenario planning to best distribute and use it. Things like if you have an N95 mask, you should put a surgical mask over it. Don't contaminate the N95 mask. And only use an N95 mask if you're doing bronchoscopy type of procedures, et cetera. And we're all doing this on the fly. We're doing the best we can under circumstances with variables that we just don't have any precedents to understand. How are you doing that in Louisville, Desiree?
Same, Saul. I mean, I work in several different community facilities, and it's the same story everywhere. And I mean, you can go on social media and everyone's talking about it. I mean, it's a crisis throughout the U.S. And I really think that's where a lot of the panic is stemming from, because we were talking about offline about the panic aspect of it, is that as people see it, are feeling it themselves and then hearing it from others, it's kind of like, oh, what do we do? And guidelines literally, like you said before, are dynamic. They are changing almost minute to minute for, okay, if you have this type of patient, you use this mask and you put this mask over it and you can use a bandana. I mean, craziness. And so I think that a lot of people are wanting to be really innovative and they want to be able to figure out what's the best way to do this, but are feeling a little bit stifled by their facilities to be innovative in that way. Is that something that you guys are dealing with there at Duke, or you've heard from colleagues across the country?
Yeah, I think there are overarching sort of rules and regulations or policies. Again, everything is fluid. I think it's also important to recognize that everybody's just trying to do the right thing. Mm-hmm. Whatever limited information they have to figure out what the right thing is. But in lieu of that, and I find this to be probably one of the most interesting things, is that there is a underlining, not too far beneath the surface, sometimes it percolates over the surface, sense of fear among healthcare providers that we all went into this profession to do the right thing for the right reasons. And I think by and large, that's absolutely true. But it would be, I think, insensitive to think that there's not a legitimate sense of fear of our own health and, safety. And I found that to be increasingly more prevalent this last week at Duke. I'm obviously in a role of leadership and have had a chance to sort of listen to the ground in a broader sense, and I think it's really important that we are not insensitive to that. How are you guys managing that?
The fear is definitely there, and we're also, to a certain extent, there's been a little bit of patting ourselves on the back because we feel prepared, etc., etc. I think the reality that's hitting now is for the people who are saying, hang on a second, when you've put all of your PPE on and you've done all of that stuff really, really well, you're taking it all off and going to crowded rooms to talk about how well you did, or to debrief, or to do your handover, or to go to that allegedly important boardroom meeting to spray your opinions on everybody else. That all should have stopped and has to stop. Everything that doesn't directly involve patient contact can, almost everything, be done over the telephone, on a computer, as we're having a perfectly reasonable discussion around the globe at the moment. It's all possible. Stop the meetings. And it feels weird to do critical care and not cuddle in a room together and talk about what we're going to do for the day and at the end of it, but it has to stop. There are different ways of doing it. It's a bit of an emotional speech, but that's what I've been hearing again from our Italian colleagues. They said the disease is not complicated, the biology is not complicated, the treatment is not that complicated. Our behavior patterns and our understanding of what it is truly like to be in a pandemic is the complicated bit.
Yeah. This is not a drill.
Yeah.
No.
Monty, one of the things, I think we had a conversation with Vicki Morton yesterday, and she's in North Carolina as well, in Charlotte. And I love the point that you made that, we are definitely having to transition our thinking into what can we do virtually, that we don't have to be standing, less than 6 feet away from someone, and you could possibly be in another country, but watching, something simple as donning and doffing PPE and making sure that people are doing that appropriately, and looking at other ways that we can utilize the technology that many of us are comfortable with because we FaceTime, we have virtual meetings, all the time. So I think that's a very valid point for sure.
One of the reasons that Hong Kong, let's hope it stayed that way, got a lid on it very, very quickly, despite having a land border with mainland China, is what we were hearing from Mike Irwin there, one of our EdPom colleagues, who's one of the professors in Hong Kong, is that the whole population has been there before. So when the siren went off, or the equivalent of that, Like in Second World War, when we were being bombed in London, you'd watch movies and the siren went off. When they were told there might be another epidemic, another pandemic like the last one, everyone knew what to do. So they went straight home. They didn't turn up to college or school the following day. They got a lid on it straight away. And he was telling us that they only had 10 patients in his hospital and none ended up on ITU. Now, let's hope it stays that way. But that, I think, is the lesson. We, building up to this relatively recently, have not been treating it as a pandemic epidemic. We've been treating it as another kind of scary thing that we've seen before, like hepatitis B or HIV. It's a boogeyman in the woods. We don't behave like that. Therefore, if we wash our hands carefully and wear more masks, we'll be okay. It's different.
Saul, I have another question for you. Have you guys been coming up with a plan about utilization of staff in different ways for your department?
We have, for example, only anesthesiology will manage airways, so that this is not a time to let somebody with less skill or competence or ability to be on the front line. And it, obviously was presumed that those with the most skill are anesthesiology providers. And so that said, our shifts have changed because we have to bake into the process some flexibility for some of our providers going down. And so the 12 or 24-hour shift is less attractive because if somebody had a 24-hour shift and they went down, that's a whole lot of hours to fill. So we parsed it into 8-hour shifts with the idea that they were baking in flexibility for the what-if scenario, and that we're all on the clock and we're all now responsible to manage all airway and related scenarios in the institution. So our roles and responsibility have sort of pivoted to be more involved that way, anticipating that will become an increasingly greater need. We're also trying to figure out how to put people who need airway and ventilatory support. We, like everybody else, are counting our ventilators carefully, and we're trying to free those up as much as we can. And we're including in that conversation the ventilators in the OR and the idea that the OR may actually be a mock ICU kind of setting because of that functional capability. And there again, some of our providers would be asked to step up to that forefront. Parenthetically, I'll add that we came up with a policy a few days back who would be within the department exempt, if you will, from that responsibility. Mm-hmm. And the three categories that came up were obviously anybody who was immunosuppressed and, being treated for anything that would require them to acknowledge an immunosuppressive state, pregnancy. And the third category was people who are 60 years old or older.
How's
that? I was going to say, how's that feel, Saul?
Yeah. So it feels uncomfortable. I mean, yeah. I will simply say that, this is the first time in my life that I had to confront that reality that I'm that guy. I'm in that category. We all think of ourselves, as, able to accept that vulnerability. It on a personal level, I will simply say it felt very weird.
Yeah, absolutely. I understand. Monty, what do you guys do in the ER at UCL?
We are still evolving those discussions because we talked to, when we interviewed Mike Grocott yesterday, I interviewed Mike Grocott yesterday, the podcast went out today on TopMedTalk. They've gone for a suggestion that over 55 should be considered at this stage as not being in the front line. Now, it depends on what you mean the front line to be, because there's no doubt that intubation and to ventilate somebody, we have to assume they're all highly likely to have COVID-19 is right in the front line. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't mean that we wouldn't be clinically active, but probably shouldn't be at this stage the people putting the tube in, if you see what I mean, because that's a high potential risk exposure area. And at this stage, we're going to, although no matter how good we think we are, we're probably not thinking as quickly under pressure if we haven't slept for 36 hours or whatever it is. So we're taking a sensible approach to that. At the same time, we've asked people to come out of retirement to bolster the working numbers. So we've got 65, 70-year-olds volunteering to come back and do that.
Physicians and nurses?
Absolutely. Wow. So it's evolving. I think what's probably more sensible in that, because we need leadership to come in numerous different guises, is to think about phasing our direct in-hospital involvement a little bit more. Because at the moment, everyone's been rushing in to have the preparatory meetings, rushing home, rushing in, rushing home. we probably should have stayed at home and got on doing this sort of meeting earlier to try and keep as many people healthy for as long as possible to step up when the step up time comes.
Yeah.
So we need to think more about that now.
I mean, the fear of not necessarily your own personal safety, but the safety of your family, coming home and bringing it to them and, spread through that. So it's going to be interesting for sure. So just in those last couple of minutes here, tell us what's happening at home and in your community there. Obviously we know things are are being shut down, schools are out, but how do you feel, what's kind of happening on the ground there?
Well, I can tell you that it's very difficult to find a grocery store that has toilet paper on its shelf.
What is that? What is that all about? It's great.
Crazy that of all the commodities, that's the one that is the most precious right now.
But it's been a global phenomenon.
Isn't that interesting?
It's spread. What you need to do is get toilet paper.
That's right. So everybody's got lots of Progresso soup and, various beans and peas. But God help us if we find a grocery store that has toilet paper on its shelf. I think people are in Durham and Chapel Hill increasingly getting a greater sense of real, but they're, save the hoarding of toilet paper, a sense of calm. For example, golf clubs and golf courses are saying you can still play golf, just stay 6 feet away from your partner when you're off, kind of stuff.
Use your own clubs.
I don't know if that's good and sane to keep people with equal poise or irresponsible and careless. I honestly don't know how to react to that right now.
Well, when we play golf, Sol, it is quite a lot of distancing involved.
That's right. The one thing that we're not close to is the pin.
or each other. So.
That's right.
Okay, so I've had tons of people reach out to me and, they're asking us questions. And so you guys are some of the smartest people I know. So a couple questions people keep asking me. One is, what are you hearing about the use of treatments when it comes to COVID? The Plaquenil, hydrochloroquine, I can never say that correctly. Yeah. And Z-Pak. Have you heard anything?
So Desiree, I have. I was speaking to you guys earlier before we, went on this broadcast. One of my nephews, who is on a family chat line, and we every Saturday at 1:00 bring all of us together to just hang virtually together. My nephew right now, who is in the embassy in Nigeria in the State Department, I had a really cool, interesting insight to that. When you look at the Johns Hopkins heat maps and all the other epidemiologic prevalence maps, there's very little representation of cases in the subcontinent of Africa. Now, many of us just presume, and I am one of them, that that's just a function of their inability to report accurately and that we dismiss it as, a reporting signal. He actually had a very interesting perspective to that. He is coming through a lens of Africa, said that there seems to be a theory that people who have had prior exposure to malaria and the subpopulation of people with sickle cell disease have some kind of immunity to this virus. And that essentially everybody in Africa has been exposed to malaria several times. In the country of Nigeria, for example, he shared with us yesterday, there are 12 reported cases, and 12 is very, very low. And of those 12, they're all Europeans, and nobody who is a native African has been officially at less, and this is through his lens of the State Department, diagnosed with this COVID-19. I think it's a phenomenally interesting observation, and whether or not that bears truth, we'll see. But the idea that malaria and or sickle cell portends some kind of immunity to this is very, very fascinating.
Which country did you say he was in again, Sol?
He's in Nigeria.
Nigeria. Okay, so you can have a longer conversation about some of the speculative work about the biology behind this, because your ACE phenotype is also in play, as you'll know from some of the biology of the ACE2 receptor, not only just the ACE antagonists, but there is some prior work, and the distribution of the ACE genotype is quite different in Africa than it is in our populations.
Right.
That's a fascinating conversation to have as this matures. But back to your question, Desiree, I would say don't, personally, unless it's in some sort of trial, I would not encourage people to start self-experimenting with things that, I wasn't suggesting with proposing that, but there has been some self-experimentation that has been reported in some places with, for example, taking drugs designed for malaria prophylaxis, and it hasn't necessarily always turned out that well because they can have unpleasant side effects
Toxicity,
and quite
definitely.
dangerous side effects.
Yeah.
So.
No,
I think that's really important. And I think to that level, I think what Anthony Fauci and other leaders, scientifically credible leaders, are espousing is very sound. We still have to be scientists, and we still have to let the scientific process play itself out. I'm hearing crazy stories, people gargling with bleach or things ridiculous like that.
My God.
Oh my God. No, the answer is we don't know yet. There are some very worthwhile hypotheses that appear to be worthy of testing, but it is very preliminary right now.
There are some trials either happening, controlled trials that are accelerated because of the nature of the crisis, including opportunities for frontline workers to take part in trials to look at the prophylactic potential here, which will be adaptive in design if they go forward. But I wouldn't know personally, just keep listening and work with your clinicians, physicians.
Yeah. So no stockpiling of this, because I personally, one of my dear friends takes it for lupus. And I told her, I was like, go and buy extra stock, because I've heard of people, like they're starting to hoard that like the toilet paper. And it just concerns me when we don't have anything official out there. So another big question before we get off the line, I know we only have a couple more minutes, smoking and vaping. How have you been hearing that there are higher incidents of ventilatory support needed for smokers?
I have heard that. I don't know any data that supports that in an objective way, but it certainly teleologically makes sense to suppose that there's a strong relationship or association. So yes, I confirm that I've heard that as well. If ever there was a opportunity to promote the idea that smoking and vaping ain't good for you, this would be that opportunity. But to say that I know that the data definitively draws that connection, I think is a bit presumptuous right now. But that saying, I have heard that as well.
Yeah. All right, Monty, any final thoughts before we let Saul go?
Everyone stay safe. Yeah. Keep distancing and stop the meetings. We've got to lead by example. We're telling our friends not to go to pubs and bars and stuff. We keep rushing in to gather in rooms to spray ideas over each other. Stop.
Stay calm and carry on.
Yeah, exactly.
There you go. Keep doing what we do, I think is the thing. Well, again, thanks for listening. Saul, thanks for joining us and taking the time with us on a Sunday afternoon to chat, and look forward to hearing more from you over the coming days and weeks. Thanks again for listening to TopMedTalk. Be sure to follow us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. If you have any pressing questions for any of our guests, don't hesitate to reach out through social media. You can send us a message, or you can send a message to contact@topmedtalk.com. That's contact@topmedtalk.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. Stay safe out there.
TopMedTalk.
It's Desiree Chappell here. Just a quick reminder, subscribe to TopMedTalk. We're a daily source of news and conversation focused on perioperative care. We bring you all the latest talk from all the major conferences in the perioperative space. We can also be found on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and we now have a free mailing list with special offers and additional goodies for subscribers. Go check us out at topmedtalk.com. That's www.topmedtalk.com.